The public imagination is held captive by the missile, the launch-on warning protocol, the kinetic exchange. This is a fatal miscalculation. The primary vector for the next systemic conflict is not a warhead. It is silence. Adversary doctrine no longer prioritizes the destruction of assets. It prioritizes the destruction of consensus. They calculate, with mathematical precision, that a nation whose political leaders warn of being incited into civil war, and whose populace is fractured by economic pressures like housing crises, lacks the social solvency for a total war footing. Why risk a kinetic response when a cheaper, non-attributable strike delivers superior leverage? CSIS reports map the new battle space, not cities, but the abyssal plains of the deep ocean, severing the handful of fiber optic cables that function as the global economy's central nervous system. Simultaneously, RUSI models a coordinated blinding of low Earth orbit satellites. Command, control, communications, and intelligence erased, not with an explosion, but with a targeted flicker of directed energy. It is the textbook definition of asymmetric escalation. This is the blueprint to create the blind Leviathan. A superpower, militarily overextended and dependent on Allied support, is suddenly rendered deaf and digitally decapitated. It possesses the world's most advanced arsenal, but has no targets, no data, no orders. A liability trapped inside its own borders, governed by silence. The motive is not ideology. It is solvency. A state facing systemic insolvency, evidenced by internal economic decay like the affordable housing crisis in San Diego, lacks the financial and social capital to prosecute a popular, protracted war. When political fractures escalate to the point where officials openly warn of being incited into civil war, the state's capacity for unified action evaporates. This internal weakness is not a domestic issue, it is a global liability. Analysts at CSIS reframed the Ukraine conflict not as simple expansionism, but as a solvency crisis for Russia. Faced with domestic liability and the prospect of an unpopular war, the protocol shifted. Weakness forced a pivot to asymmetry. The operational goal becomes achieving a limited, strategic objective with overwhelming speed, bypassing the need for sustained economic mobilization and popular consent. This is the blueprint. When a nation cannot afford a long war, it is incentivized to launch a short one. This dynamic creates a deterrence liability. An adversary performs a simple cost-benefit analysis. They observe a military overextended, where data from past conflicts like Afghanistan shows a heavy reliance on partners, with 1 in 3 coalition deaths being non-U.S. personnel. They see a political class consumed by internal division and a population strained by economic failure. The calculation is cold and mathematical. The target nation lacks the political solvency to risk a launch-on warning scenario in response to a limited, non-existential kinetic strike. The motive, therefore, is the exploitation of this liability. It is a zero-sum calculation to leverage an adversary's internal decay as a vector for kinetic action. By forcing a choice between accepting a limited strategic defeat or initiating a total war its own fractured society cannot withstand, the aggressor transforms domestic weakness into the primary accelerant for global brinkmanship. The weakness is not the precursor to conflict, it is the invitation. The financial calculus of modern conflict has been inverted. The core equation, confirmed by analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, is the new accelerant for systemic collapse. A $5 million main battle tank is now a liability, rendered combat ineffective by a $500 drone. This is not a battlefield anomaly. It is the new economic protocol. The term is the democratization of violence. The barrier to entry for projecting lethal strategic force has been effectively zeroed out. Adversaries no longer need to match industrial output. They weaponize this cost-exchange ratio as an asymmetric financial attack, forcing a 10,000 to 1 loss on a legacy military. It is a mathematical vector designed to bankrupt a nation's defense solvency before the first shot of a conventional war is even fired. The prevailing analysis of regional instability is obsolete. Flashpoints in areas like Southern Africa or social fractures within allied nations like Canada are not the root cause of systemic risk. They are proxy laboratories, gray zones deliberately selected and cultivated for staging asymmetric attacks. These zones function as launch pads, allowing adversaries to test response times and political will without direct attribution. The objective is to calculate the precise kinetic cost required to trigger a systemic cascade within a target nation. The adversary's calculation is based on a single equation, the deterrence liability. This liability is a function of two primary inputs. First, domestic insolvency. The data points are unequivocal. Economic fragility, evidenced by crises in core metrics like affordable housing in San Diego, is now a national security variable. This is compounded by political fracture, with warnings of internal conflict becoming mainstream political discourse. CSYS reports confirm that social cohesion is the primary target for pre-kinetic shaping operations. The second input is military overextension. Analysis of the Afghanistan conflict, for example, reveals a critical dependency, with 1 in 3 Allied deaths being non-U.S. personnel. This operational stretch, combined with ongoing volatility in geostrategic arenas like the Middle East, creates a mathematical incentive for adversaries. They calculate that a nation battling itself over economic solvency and political legitimacy lacks the unity to risk total war in response to a limited, strategic strike launched from a deniable gray zone. This is the new protocol for great power conflict. It bypasses conventional force-on-force engagement. Domestic decay has been weaponized, transforming it from a political issue into the primary accelerant for nuclear brinkmanship. According to RUSI analysts, the next phase is not a declaration of war. It will be a non-attributable systemic shock, likely targeting financial or energy infrastructure, originating from a proxy territory. The goal is not to defeat the military, but to bankrupt the political and social solvency required to deploy it. The math is irrefutable. The launch-on-warning doctrine is not a strategy. It is a time-based algorithm designed to counter a decapitation strike. The protocol dictates that if early warning systems detect an inbound nuclear launch, a retaliatory strike is launched immediately, before the incoming warheads can destroy command and control infrastructure. This is a mathematical calculation of survival. Absorb the first strike and lose the ability to respond, or launch on detection and guarantee mutual destruction. The critical vulnerability is the integrity of the detection signal itself. Analysts at CSYS have modeled scenarios where an adversary executes a targeted cyber attack, not to disable the system, but to corrupt it. This initiates the fog of digital war. Radars are not blinded. They are instead fed a high-fidelity simulation of a mass launch. The system shows enemy missiles in the air with valid trajectories and heat signatures. This presents the commander with a solvency crisis of information. There is no time to verify if the data is real or a digital ghost. The protocol's clock is running. To hesitate is to bet the nation's existence on the hope that it's a bluff. But the adversary's calculus, factoring in our domestic fracture and economic fragility, is that we lack the political solvency to absorb a real first strike. Therefore, the commander is mathematically forced to assume the attack is real. The fear of being wrong becomes the trigger. This is how a cyber attack bypasses conventional deterrence and forces a kinetic launch. The primary accelerant for kinetic conflict is no longer military disparity. It is domestic insolvency. Adversary calculus is now a simple equation. Internal political fracture, evidenced by public rhetoric of civil war incitement, plus severe economic fragility, like the housing solvency crisis in San Diego, equals a deterrence liability. This is not a political opinion. It is a mathematical vector for escalation. Analysts at CSIS note that decades of military overextension, underscored by high coalition casualty rates in theaters like Afghanistan, have created a perceived readiness gap. An adversary calculates that a nation battling itself lacks the political and social liquidity to absorb a limited, strategic shock and risk a total kinetic response. The incentive is to bypass conventional deterrence with an asymmetric probe. The calibration shot will not be a missile. It will be a ghost event, engineered for plausible deniability. Within 12 months, expect a coordinated, cascading blackout targeting the Port of Long Beach and its adjacent data-clearing infrastructure. The objective is not destruction, but to measure our response protocol under the weight of our own insolvency. The event will be attributed to systemic failure, but it is a launch on warning test.